Dr. CARRIE MONGLE, thanks so much for coming on to Evolutionsoup all the way from your office in New York, USA. You are an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology and Turkana Basin Institute at Stony Brook University, and your research focuses on the discovery and description of new hominin fossils from the Turkana Basin in Kenya. Just recently, your team announced the discovery of a new Paranthropus boisei fossils from the Koobi Fora site in Kenya, including hands and feet fossils, shedding new light on our understanding of early tool use and upright walking. Welcome to the show, CARRIE. A lot of work has gone into this research, so it must be really gratifying to finally be able to present your findings to the world.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to finally have this out. It's been 5 years in the making of, working really closely with Louise and the field team, and also with some of my very close collaborators who are experts on the hand and feet. I've been really surprised by the kind of reaction everyone has had to this, as far as how much interest there's been. I never expected to be quoted in National Geographic. So it's been really exciting.
Before we walk along in the footsteps of Paranthropus, let's just hear a little bit about your background. CARRIE, did you always have an interest in science and, in particular, human origins?
So I didn't really know I wanted to study human origins until college. So I grew up in Big Stone Gap, Virginia. It's a very small town in the Appalachian Mountains. And while lovely and beautiful, it's not particularly known for its human origins research. So it wasn't a field I was particularly aware of. But I had parents who were very supportive and told me to go to college and take classes on things you've never heard of. Like, expand your horizons, figure out what you want to do. And so I found my way into an anthropology major and haven't looked back. I absolutely loved it. And actually, like your previous guest, or one of your previous guests, I went to the University of Virginia, which doesn't have a huge paleoanthropology program. But I was really fortunate to have incredible mentors who were archaeologists. So Steve Plog and Rachel Most, who ran the Chaco Research Archive. And so I was a research assistant for them. And Rachel, who was a dean, and I didn't realize how busy she must have been at the time, took it upon herself to drive me an hour away to meet with one of her colleagues who did study human evolution. And Roshna Wunderlich took the day to have lunch with us and tell me which graduate programs to apply for, and said Stony Brook has to be on your list. And my life hasn't been the same since. So I ended up coming to Stony Brook for my PhD with Fred Grein. I did a few years of postdoc at the American Museum of Natural History, and then I ended up back at Stony Brook as faculty in the Turkana Basin Institute and Department of Anthropology just 5 years ago.
The new discoveries center around an ancient hominin called Paranthropus. CARRIE, what do we know about this genus, and is it in any way related to modern human beings?
I like to think of this group of species as our evolutionary cousin and the path not taken. So if we think about human evolution, the genus Homo and Paranthropus would have both kind of diverged from a common Australopithecine ancestor probably around 3.5 million years ago. And so I think, the species leading to us today are a bit more well understood as far as the general public goes. So we think about Homo habilis and Homo erectus and these early members of the genus Homo getting bigger brains and maybe expanding their behavioral repertoire, using more stone tools, and ultimately leading to us. At the same time, and living in the same places, Paranthropus was potentially becoming very specialized in a different ecology. So they're both lineages are adapting to a drying and changing environment. Homo seemingly did that by becoming more adaptable, more variable in their behavior. While Paranthropus, we see taking that initial Australopithecine morphology and making everything about it extreme. So their chewing muscles got huge, their jaws got huge, they have these crests on their skulls for attachment of some of these chewing muscles, and their teeth are almost 4 times the size of what we see human teeth looking like today. So a lot of research has gone into the skulls and teeth of these hominins to try to figure out what they were possibly doing with them. If we think about the different species of Paranthropus, the very earliest one is something called Paranthropus ethiopicus. It's known from Eastern Africa. There's a Southern African Paranthropus species called Paranthropus robustus. And then the one that I've been working on is around at about the same time, but in Eastern Africa. It's called Paranthropus boisei. And I wanted to just talk a little bit more in detail about what we know about their diet and how we know that. So a lot of previous research has gone into things like dental isotopes, trying to figure out what a species was eating, because the old adage is true, you are what you eat. And so there are bits of your diet reflected in the tissues that your body lays down, and in particular in the dental enamel. So people have looked at carbon isotope values in the dental enamel of various hominins, and it turns out for Paranthropus boisei, they had a pretty unusual diet compared to everyone else. So when we think about carbon isotopes, we divide them into C3 plants and C4 plants. And on the African landscape, C3 plants, you can think of the things that giraffes eat, right? So things that are like leaves up in the trees, or maybe the things that the monkeys are eating, like fruits that are coming off of those trees. In comparison, a C4 plant signature is going to be coming from something like a grass. So we think about kind of the African savanna grassland. It's either going to be the blades of grass, or maybe if it had some kind of an underground storage organ, things along those lines. And Paranthropus boisei has an extremely high C4 signature compared to every other hominin. And so then the question is, was this hominin eating grass? If you look at the wear patterns on their teeth, they seem to be fairly striated, so it doesn't seem that they were eating nuts like the kind of initial Nutcracker Man hypothesis. You would see pits in that case. So they were either eating some kind of grasses, maybe some kind of reeds near the lake margin, or maybe like the underground storage organs associated with those grasses. We could also venture a guess that they could have had some part of their diet of animals that were eating those grasses. So you can get that plant signature either from consuming the plant or consuming something that consumed the plant. If we think about the modern American diet and what we all eat, we would also have a very Paranthropus boisei-like signature, because corn is a C4 plant. And so we all eat, probably 90% of our diet is either animals that have eaten corn or some form of processed food that is corn-based. Thinking about other things that we know about Paranthropus, while there's been an incredible amount of study on the skulls and the teeth, very little of the postcranial skeleton is actually known. So there are a few elements, a partial lower limb bone and a partial radius from Olduvai, but beyond that, we don't really know anything about how they were moving around the landscape. So thinking about Paranthropus as this kind of evolutionary path not taken, right? They're our evolutionary cousin. They were on the landscape at exactly the same time as early Homo and early members of Homo erectus. Why do we have modern humans today? So presumably the direct descendants of something like Homo erectus, and no Paranthropus walking around. And I think we can think about that as far as their adaptation to what at the time was a particular environment with particular resources, and seemingly they became very specialized on this resource. And if the environment changes and the resource disappears and you're specialized for this one particular thing, I think we can hypothesized that that might lead to the extinction of a species, whatever that resource was. And we see this today really in conservation efforts with global climate change, is that the species that are the most endangered are the ones that are the most reliant on particular resources or particular ecologies, versus we can think about New York City rats or squirrels. They thrive in these changing landscapes because they are adaptable and eat anything, including pizza trash.
The new findings of Paranthropus boisei hands and feet fossils are particularly significant considering the history of fossil finds in Kenya, going right back to the work of famed paleoanthropologists Lewis and Mary Leakey. What is the story of the Leakeys, and how do these fossils shed new light on those original discoveries?
Thanks for this question. I love talking about this in a historical context. If we think about early discoveries in paleoanthropology and how we figure out kind of where humanity came from, in the kind of 19th and early 20th century, most scientists were convinced it wasn't Africa. In 1924, Raymond Dart announced the Tong child in South Africa, which we now know as Australopithecus africanus. But at the time, it was very controversial, and most people said this is just another ape. There's no way that's a hominin. And it was a juvenile, it was a little baby cranium, and so it was really hard to make that direct link. The Leakeys were also convinced that the story must take place in Africa, and so they set out to find evidence for that. In particular, they were working in Olduvai in Tanzania. And they had been finding for a really long time stone tools in the area. And so they were out searching for the hominin that had made those stone tools. They thought this must be the place for human origins. And in 1959, Mary Leakey discovered the Zinjanthropus, what we now call Paranthropus boisei, cranium. So this is the very first time we get a look at this hominin. And because you find a hominin nicely in place with these stone tools, it was assumed that, of course, this was the toolmaker, right? So we've got Zinjanthropus OH5 is the toolmaker. They continued excavation and work in that area, and fairly soon after found fossils of hominins that look much more like us. So this is what would become Homo habilis. And because it had smaller teeth and a seemingly larger brain and was on the lineage, they thought, to modern humans, Zinjanthropus kind of lost its place as the toolmaker, and Homo habilis was then named as the handyman. So this was the maker of the stone tools. Of course, we now know that hominins were making stone tools much earlier than this, and so it's probably not a surprise that Paranthropus could have been making stone tools, and certainly other researchers have pointed that out. But we liked that we could tie into this historical debate of kind of Zinj getting his tools back.
You were asked by Louise Leakey, granddaughter of Lewis and Mary Leakey, to work on the hand fossil that her team had uncovered in the Turkana Basin, bringing the Leakey family's toolmaker research full circle. Carrie, can you talk about these discoveries and what they tell us about Paranthropus, and why associating tools with this hominin is especially significant?
Yeah, I'd love to. I'll first start with the history of discovery for this particular fossil. So Louise Leakey directs the Koobi Fora research project. And one of the incredible and really special things about this project is that it is fully comprised of local community members who know the area and who are able to basically look for fossils all year round. Hominin fossils are incredibly rare and they're very hard to find. And so we are so fortunate to have a team of dedicated fossil hunters who know the landscape and know what they're looking for and are out searching probably 8 months of the year. That's just not comparable to what you can do with a 6-week field season we typically think of with Western scientists coming in, setting up a tent, and going out and looking for fossils. And that's what enables some of these really incredible discoveries. And so on one of those surveys, one of the team members, John, was out looking in Koobi Fora formation deposits, and he noticed on the landscape what turned out to be the lower molar of this individual. Paranthropus teeth are pretty distinctive. As I said earlier, they're very large, but still to notice this amongst, millions of rocks on the landscape, I think is just incredible and takes such a trained eye. So the team honed in on this area. Anytime they initially discover anything hominin, all hands on deck. So all 15 or 20 people come over and start really closely looking around, particularly under the direction of Cyprian Niete, who directs these kind of field surveys and excavations when Louise is in Nairobi. And so as they were looking around, Martin Carrigne notices about 7 meters away a bone from the hand. And at the time, it was so large and so unusual, they weren't even sure it was hominin. It wasn't what they had in mind for what a hominin hand of this age would look like. So they keep looking at the site. They collect surface rocks and fragments, and they put them through sieves and bring back anything that could be bone to the Turkana Basin Institute Research Lab in Illiret, which is about 3 hours north by car. At this point, Louise goes and takes a look, and her kind of first pass job is to figure out, okay, what in this could possibly be hominin, and what are we looking at that is bovid, crocodile, carnivore, monkey, anything else, because this is a dynamic landscape and hominins are not the only animals on it. And so a lot of time is spent figuring out what belongs to a hyena, what belongs to an antelope, and what could actually be hominin. At this point, so this was in 2019, she pulled out a few other things that she thought this could potentially be a hominin hand. There was maybe a wrist bone, one wrist bone, and 1 or 2 finger bones that could have been hominin, and then there were a few more teeth that they had found. And so she sends an email to Dr. Fred Grein, who's at Stony Brook here, and it had a picture of kind of these few fossil fragments and said, hey, do you think this is something you would want to take a look at? And very fortunately for me, he said, well, I'm maybe a little bit busy to fly out to Kenya right now, but I've got this colleague coming in starting at Stony Brook next year. Her role is supposed to be to work with the Turkana Basin Institute. Why don't you ask her to look at it? And at this point, I was a postdoctoral researcher and get an email from Louise Leakey to come look at a hominin fossil, which is a huge opportunity, something that I jumped on immediately. And so within a few weeks, I was on a plane to Kenya to go out and look at these with her. So we spent several weeks sitting in the research lab up at TBI, looking through fragments and trying to figure out which pieces could be part of this hominin. And it became obvious that there was a decent amount there. And so with that in mind, all of her team members came in, and we had an anatomy lesson in the field in which we went through and showed them these are what hominin hand bones look like. We have, modern human hands. So this is what you should really be looking for when you're opening up this excavation. And again, they're incredible. Once they have a kind of vision of what they're looking for, they can find it. So they went back out and they excavated for 2 more years. They moved tons of sediment. This was a huge undertaking, basically taking down an entire hillside. In the process of doing that, we were able to recover this nearly complete hand, but once they finished the excavation, they actually got down to the base layer of that sediment and found the hominin footprint trackway, which was published in Science by Kevin Hatala last year. So it was really a 2-for-1 deal on this excavation, completely different sedimentary layer, but because they were trying to make sure they got every last bit of this fossil, they got down to another layer, and that just happened to have hominin footprints in it. So once we actually had sifted through all of these fragments and had what appeared to be a fairly complete hand, it was time to switch to analysis mode and figuring out what it could actually be and then what it was doing with its hand. Very fortunately for us, we had bits of the skull and a good number of teeth. And with Paranthropus, there's such an unusual species that when you have a tooth or you have a bit of the cranium, it's very diagnostic. So that was the easy part, was figuring out which species this was. I was pretty easily able to determine that this was Paranthropus boisei very early on. But then the hard part came, is figuring out what were they doing with this hand. And that's where co-authors are incredible, because I personally am not a hand expert, but I know people who are. And so I reached out to Kaylee Orr and Matt Tocheri, who are the second and third co-authors on this study, to ask them to help me figure it out. So, using their vast collection of comparative data, they've scanned hundreds of ape wrist bones and finger bones and human bones, to look at this hand in context and try to figure out what it was doing with it and why it looks so unusual in certain ways. And a few things came to the surface. So one that we can talk about is that the proportions of our hands in modern humans are fairly unique amongst other apes. So humans are unique in having a very robust and very long thumb. And in this particular specimen, it's complete enough that we can estimate those ratios here as well. And what we found, or I should say what Kaylee and Matt found in this case, is that this Paranthropus boisei would have been capable of human-like precision grip. Its thumb to finger ratio is very similar to what we see in the genus Homo. And this is one of the reasons that we're suggesting it would have been fully capable of making, or at least holding and manipulating, stone tools. But there are other kind of surprising aspects of it. So if we look at the species that came just before and probably gave rise to Paranthropus, some kind of australopithecine, we do have hands from them as well, and they all have fairly curved fingers, indicating that they probably were still a little bit arboreal. In this individual, we see very straight finger bones, which we took to indicate that they likely were not very arboreal. At the same time, they have some unusual gorilla-like anatomy, and particularly in the pinky side of the hand, as well as in some of the attachments on the finger bones, but really focusing on the pinky side of the hand. It would have been incredibly muscular, and again, that's something that we only see in gorillas. So why do we have this hominin with really straight fingers, human-like proportions to its hand, but gorilla-like strength in the palm of the hand? And so we threw out the hypothesis that, we know they have a very unusual diet, right? We know that Paranthropus boisei was seemingly focusing on C4 grasses. If we look at how modern gorillas use their hands, it's not just for climbing, they also use them for processing food. So you see them pulling off leaves, opening up branches, accessing maybe more difficult parts to get to, like pith inside of them. And so we suggest that potentially these convergent morphologies that we see in this hand could be the result of dietary specialization. But of course, that's speculation. And so I think the task at hand is, no pun intended, is to look more at the kind of cortical and trabecular distribution in these bones and see if we can really say more about how they were using them. Yeah, and so I actually have the 3D print of the hand right here to give everyone an idea of how large it was. This was, I think, a pretty chunky hand. As far as actual size, you can see it's a bit bigger than my own, but I wanted to point out how broad these finger bones are, and how flat they are. You can also see with the thumb, the distal part of the thumb, how broad that is, which would have been helpful for a precision grip. But I'm sure it's a little difficult to see, but at least maybe in some of the pictures that we published, people will be able to look at this and see that the hamate, which is one of our wrist bones, the hook of that is massive. And then we also have on the MC5, the fifth metacarpal, which is this palm bone on the pinky side, also has a really large muscle insertion there. And so that's one of the reasons we're saying they would have had such gorilla-like musculature on that side of the hand.
Carrie, do you find that sometimes people say to you that, well, monkeys use tools, crows even use tools? I mean, why then is this Paranthropus hand find, so distinct?
Yeah, so I think it's really important to distinguish what we think of as hominin tool use and kind of uniquely human tool use compared to what we see in the rest of the animal kingdom. And that's not to discredit crows. I think they're incredibly intelligent animals. And it's so impressive how they're able to kind of use things around them to get what they want. But we can talk more about maybe our closest living relatives and chimpanzees and how they use tools. Um, Going back to some of Jane Goodall's original observations, which really did change how we think about them. So we know that chimps are capable of, let's say, finding a branch and stripping all of the leaves off of it, and then using that as a tool to extract termites, maybe from a log. And there are other examples of maybe capuchins will pick up a rock and use that to break open something that they want to get access to. When we think about hominin tool use and why we think of it as a real kind of landmark change in human evolution, the difference is the ability to take a raw material, in this case a rock, and have in your mind's eye a totally different shape and form and function for that material. So when we think about hominins making and using tools, we're thinking about them taking maybe a round stone and then intentionally removing parts of it to create an entirely new shape or a new form. Um, like I said earlier, we know that hominins earlier than Paranthropus were doing this. So at about 3.3 million years ago at the site of Leakeys, there's been evidence for some very early stone tools on the landscape. At the same time, we know just a little bit north up in Dakika, there's evidence for cut marks on animal bones, so suggesting these hominins were using some kind of a stone tool to access animal resources. And so it's not at all surprising to suggest that Paranthropus would have also been capable of using stone tools if something like afarensis was also using them earlier on. But we really wanted to weigh into this debate from the perspective of the comparison with Homo habilis and how, very early on, Homo habilis was taken as the tool maker and Paranthropus gets kind of pushed to the side. So now at least we have the anatomical evidence to say that they would have been very much capable of also making these stone tools.
As well as hand bones, the team also uncovered foot bones. So, what do these fossils tell us about how Paranthropus walked and if it walked upright?
So we have an embarrassment of riches when it comes to this fossil, and the feet didn't even really get the center spotlight, but we do have three bones that go with the foot of this individual, and they're remarkably informative for how little we have. I wanted to give a little bit of the backstory of how they were found in the first place, which is that, so I knew that we had two toe bones, but how exciting are two toe bones? Um, but a few years into the excavations and the sieving fragments, Louise and I had been looking at bone fragments for so long that we thought there can't possibly be any more hominin in these boxes. We're just going to put them on the shelf and move on with the analysis of the hand. But Cody Pring, who's an expert on the foot and of course is then honed in to look at or look for foot bones, went through some of these boxes again when he was there working on a different fossil, and pulled out half of a metatarsal, which we had just looked over 100 times. And to give ourselves some credit, it was covered in some matrix, so it wasn't that there was just a pristine foot bone sitting there, but he was able to pick this out of the box of fragments, and so he came on to the team to do some of these foot analyses. What his analyses have shown, I think, are really exciting. They show that this species would have had a transverse arch in their foot. And when we think about human bipedalism, one of the things that is so effective about the way we use our feet is that we have arches to the foot that make it much more efficient. So if you ever watch a chimp walking around on two legs, you'll notice they have very flat feet. And so their foot kind of rolls off of the ground. And it's our arches that conserve a lot of that energy that the chimps are losing. So we have this very kind of bipedally oriented adaptation in the metatarsal, in the foot bone. And you compare that with these toe bones. So we had the big toe and then one of the other four, who knows. We can say a few things about those. They're very short and they're very straight. So those two things, I think, again, go with this idea that it's a bipedal hominin, that this wasn't a foot that was used for grasping because they were very short little toes. It'd be like one of us trying to use our toes to grasp onto a branch with. It's just not very effective. And then Cody also did some analyses looking at the articulation between the toe and the rest of the foot. And again, it's shaped fairly similar to our own, which would have allowed this kind of human-like toe-off mechanism that we associate with bipedal locomotion.
Well, these findings represent a watershed moment in our understanding of not only Paranthropus, but also related hominin species. So, what's next for you, Carrie? What upcoming projects can you tell us about?
I am so lucky to continue on as a member of the Koobi Fora research project because Louise and her team have been finding fossils faster than I can describe them, which is a really incredible problem to have. So we recently got back from a trip to the European synchrotron to scan a few new fossils there. One of the exciting things about that kind of technology is we can get the most out of these fossils we possibly can, and that's down to the kind of histological level of kind of daily growth and how these individuals grew up and what their lives looked like. So there's a new fossil that we just took to scan for that. So stay tuned, although that's a lot of data processing on my end still to go. It'll be a few years. But I think also very exciting is the team is out in the field as we speak. Well, probably not in Kenya. It's about 9 p.m. But they're still actively working a new hominin fossil site that's, I think, giving us some exciting and new information about a postcranial skeleton. Again, looking at some of these hominins and how they were walking around the landscape in this kind of new age of linked communication and global research. I'm getting WhatsApp messages from Louise with pictures of fossils as they're coming out. And so that's incredibly exciting, and I can't wait to get there in March to take a look myself. And if anyone wants to come with me, I will say when I go in March, it's for the Turkana Basin Institute Field School. And Louise and I co-teach a module in that, and students actually go out to some of these excavations and help find hominin fossils. And so I can't think of a better opportunity for a student who wants to get into studying human evolution than to go into the field with Louise Leakey and be part of this kind of ongoing legacy of finding human origins in Eastern Africa.
Dr. Carrie Mongle, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation.